Recently, Steve Kiltonick met with CAROLYN ZABLOTNY, one of the scheduled keynote speakers for the Pilgrimage Day. Steve tells us now that ZABLOTNY, who serves as a communications consultant for the Dorothy Day Guild, which has been officially charged with forwarding Day's cause for sainthood. As Steve learned, Day is a perfect role model in demonstrating acts of mercy.
Dorothy Day has been called many things: an activist, a journalist, a radical, a convert, a mother, a mystic, a prophet, and a faithful daughter of the Catholic Church. For over 50 years, she articulated the need for nonviolence and also played a leadership role in many national struggles for peace, justice, and human rights. It was through her life, her writing, and the work of the Catholic worker that she applied the teachings of Christ to modern conditions. Catholic historian David O'Brien proclaimed Day as the most important, interesting, and influential figure in the history of American Catholicism. Perhaps the title, Champion of the Poor, suits her best. CAROLYN ZABLOTNY, who lives in the Berkshire town of Mill River, is the editor of the Dorothy Day Guild newsletter. The Guild was established in 2005 to promote Day's cause for sainthood. ZABLOTNY first learned about Day in high school when she read her autobiography, The Long Loneliness.
There was one sentence that just kind of held me, how she said she wanted the abundant life, and she wanted it for others too, but she didn't have a clue as to how to go about finding that. And I think I so identified with that, so it kind of stayed in my head.
ZABLOTNY went on to attend Catholic Manhattanville College in New York during the tumultuous 1960s. It was here that she became reacquainted with Day in the school library when she noticed the Catholic Worker newsletter, which Day co-founded.
The first article, front page, was on nonviolence and struggling how to respond in the spirit of the gospel to the war raging at the time in Vietnam. And I just started to read the paper and just kept reading the paper, and it was very new, very, very fresh. But I began to get that, this is maybe, faith in action.
ZABLOTNY was inspired by Day to join what she calls an alternative radical Christian community in Harlem called Amaya's House. She worked there 8 years before pursuing a career in not-for-profit management and development.
Once you've been kind of exposed, I think, to her life story and to the Catholic worker movement in general, it just kind of stays with you and haunts you in various ways.
Day was born in Brooklyn in 1897 and baptized an Episcopalian. Her father, a sports writer, moved the family to San Francisco when she was 6. Here Day experienced the devastation of the San Francisco earthquake.
She saw this incredible kindness that people were extending one to the other, having suffered the loss of everything in the earthquake. And she saw her mother give out clothes to the poor, for example, or to the newly homeless. And that simple act of kindness imprinted itself on her.
Her family moved to Chicago, where she received a scholarship to the University of Illinois. Here she joined a socialist group. After the family returned to New York, Day left school and got a job as a writer for a socialist daily. Her circle of friends were political activists and writers. In America, it was a time of industrialization and huge gaps between rich and poor.
She always had, I think, a desire to give a human face to suffering and a human face to people who were poor. And you can see that in her earliest writings.
During the suffrage campaigns of 1917, Day was arrested and went on a 10-day hunger strike. Later, she fell in love and lived in Staten Island with a common-law husband. In 1928, she embraced the Catholic Church, conceived and baptized a daughter, and became a single mother. Day covered the 1932 Hunger March in Washington, D.C. for Commonweal. Here she prayed at the National Shrine for some spiritual direction to wed her faith with social consciousness. The next day, her prayers were answered when she met Peter Morin, who shared her ideology and later opened her up to Catholic social teaching. Together, they launched the Catholic Worker Movement in 1933.
What inspired them was the notion that the poor really were Christ. It wasn't like they were like Christ or reminiscent of Christ. So for the Catholic worker, the ideal was to get closer to Christ, and that meant then serving people as brothers and sisters in Christ.
That same year, they started the Catholic Worker newspaper, which promoted the social teachings of the church.
They realized very quickly, well, we can't just write about what we don't practice. You know, we can't divide these things.
During the Great Depression, they opened up hospitality houses, a practice which dates back to the medieval monks.
So they started on nothing, you know, with whatever they had at hand. Opened doors of an apartment house, and people came. What did they have to offer? Well, not a lot, but soup, bread, you know. But it was the gospel, you know. The practice of the works of mercy, feed the hungry, you know, clothe the naked, give drink to the thirsty.
Other houses eventually sprang up across the country and overseas. Day went on to write passionately about the events and social conditions of the 20th century in columns, books, and articles. During the 1940s, Day wrote of the immorality of war and the draft. She was a leading voice in American Catholic circles for militant pacifism. In the 1950s, she opposed the testing and proliferation of nuclear weapons. In the 60s, Day worked for integration, publicly opposed the Vietnam War, and prayed and fasted for peace at the Second Vatican Council. In the 1970s, she supported the nonviolent struggle of the United Farm Workers, spending 12 days in a California jail at age 75 for picketing with Cesar Chavez.
She didn't say, come join me. She just sat down. She just said no. And others saw that example and joined in.
Day's philosophy of service, voluntary poverty, and her sustaining vision of nonviolence as a means of bettering society inspired countless thousands. In the process, she helped change the thinking of the Catholic community in the U.S. and throughout the world. On November 29, 1980, at New York's Mary House Hospice, Day died as she had lived, working with ordinary poor people for social change. Dorothy Day may not be a household name yet, but her life and works are becoming increasingly known. In 2000, Cardinal John O'Connor of New York initiated the cause of her sainthood. The Vatican approved, granting her the title Servant of God. And in 2012, U.S. bishops unanimously voted to endorse her as a saint. The Dorothy Day Guild promotes her as a woman of conscience and a saint for our time.
If Dorothy Day isn't a saint, I don't know who is. Really. And there are a lot of people, I think, who would say to you the same.
When Pope Francis addressed Congress last fall, Day's cause for sainthood was raised 100-fold when the pontiff mentioned Day in the same breath as Abe Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and Thomas Merton.
Her social activism, her passion for justice and for the cause of the oppressed were inspired by the gospel, her faith, and the example of the saints.
Reaction was one of disbelief.
The phone among the people involved in this was just, you know, people were crying, tears streaming down the cheeks. No one knew he was, And we feel very encouraged because of Francis's statement, to the Congress that we think it will happen.
ZABLOTNY says that whether Day achieves sainthood or not, she will continue to inspire future generations as she already has inspired so many before.
I think the really exciting thing is because of her, at least for me, you somehow realize that you believe a little more, you maybe even pray a little more, and I'd like to think you love a little more.
Dorothy Day, a saint for our time? Only time will tell. For Real to Real, I'm Steve Kiltonick.